All right. Hello, everyone. Let's start our last keynote speech today. First, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Professor Li Jing, a faculty member in the Modern Language Department, but also Director of Global Asian Studies, which is a partner of the STRC. And we're very honored to have our final keynote speaker and author, David Mura. And I know his bio is on this brochure, but pretend you can't read. Okay? So he's very prolific writer. He's a memoirist, essayist, novelist, poet, critic, playwright, and performance artist. And Mura's latest book is The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths and Our American Narratives. There's a lot. Okay, sorry, let me finish the entire one. By white Americans and African Americans. And his book actually right now still on display right now, right? By the bookstore display table. If you want to buy the copies there, I flip through over there. There are quite a few copies available there. And his last book centered on creative writing and race, a stranger's journey, race, identity, and narrative craft in writing, published in 2018 by University of Georgia Press. With the essayist Carolyn Holbrook, Mura is co-editor of anthology of Minnesota BIPOC writers. We Are Meant to Rise, Voices from Justice from Minneapolis to the World, published by University Minnesota Press in 2021. A Sansei or third generation Japanese American, Mura has written 2 memoirs, Turning Japanese, Memoirs of a Sansei, published by Grove Atlantis, which chronicles his year-long stay in Japan, which won a 1991 Josephine Miles Book Award from the Oakland PEN, and was listed in the New York Times notable books of the year. And Where the Body MeetsMemory, Odyssey of Race, Sexuality and Identity, published in 1996 by Anchor and Random. His novel, Famous Suicides of the Japanese Empire, published 2008 by Coffee House Press, was the finalist for the Minnesota Book Award, the John Gardner Fiction Prize, and Virginia Commonwealth University Campbell First Novelist Award. And he also published 4 books of poetry, including The Last Incantations.
We can stop.
We don't have to stop. Anyway, I know I don't read the book.
I write books. That's enough.
I want to stress one more thing here. So one of our, we are from Global Asian Studies, some of our faculty really include your writing, your articles, for example, the Asian Japanese Americans in the post-war era, the white gaze and the silent sexual subject. They wanted me to mention about this one. They think you're a really good writer. So anyway, if you haven't read a book yet, please go ahead, check out his books and articles as well. All right, now let's give the floor to our last panel speaker.
Yeah. Thank you. I wanted to thank STRC and Billy Johnson Gonzalez and Judy Freeman for bringing me in. Also, Alex Delgado for helping me to come in. In his book, Red, White, and Black, U.S. Cinema and the Structure of Racial Antagonisms, my friend Frank Wilderson talks about how at the gates of Berkeley, there was a Native American who had a table. And the table said, settle your land lease agreement here. And Wilderson asked, is that Native American crazy? Because that's what many people thought. And his answer is, no, he just doesn't have a big enough gun. So the idea that you can, even the notion of what is sane and what is insane comes from structures of political power. Now, the Japanese American version here is my parents at ages 11 and 15, and my grandparents were imprisoned during World War II by the United States government for being a threat, a fifth column threat to America. It was a trope which is used often against Asian Americans, where we are a perpetual fifth column, a perpetual danger to the security of the United States. Now, after they were released, they had to go back in American society. So a family friend applied for a job and he had to take a psychology test. So this is about the test. Internment camp psychology, circa 1945. Just after his release, Moss took a psychological test. 3 questions he never forgot. Do you think people are out to get you? Do you feel you are being followed? When you see a crowd of strangers walking towards you, do you try to avoid them? To all 3, he answered yes, and knew he sounded insane. My book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, is in part about whose story gets told, whose story of America gets told. And just as importantly, whose story is heard, whose story is believed. And the premise is that political power, cultural power, economic power comes out of the ability to be heard, to have your story heard. And if your story is not heard or is not believed, you're in a very different position. Now, the other thing that's happening in America, what we see is that, frankly, white America is going through a crisis of identity. Because they realize that after 2040, there will no longer be a white majority. Now, the great Black writer James Baldwin observed, the question of identity is a question inducing the most profound panic, a terror as primary as a nightmare of the mortal fall. So what Baldwin is saying is that the questions one identity is scary as confronting your own death. And in many ways, that's what white America is now confronting. Because it is the questioning of what it means to be white and what whiteness, which I'll explain in a bit, is. Now, we come to a point where people are scared to talk about race, right? You're scared of making a mistake, but no one in America knows everything about race. We all have pockets of ignorance. We all have things we don't know, and we all have things we don't know. So what I would say is that we must approach this subject with a sense of humility. And this includes everybody in America, right? So this is a spiritual humility. I'm a fallible human being. I can make mistakes. I'm not perfect. And an epistemic humility. Maybe I don't know. And maybe I don't know what I don't know. Similarly, no one can perform race perfectly. We all have ideas in our heads that may be erroneous, problematic. We are all capable of saying things that may be stupid or sexist. And so we have to also forgive each other for making mistakes and allow people to recover. So I'm saying, I'm not here to shame or guilt anyone, right? When you speak about race, oftentimes people, they get their hackles up. It's like I'm not a bad person. But you don't change people through shame and guilt. I believe you change people through love and knowledge. And so, I want America to live up to its ideals, which it still hasn't done. Now, I speak as a 3rd-generation Japanese American. My grandfather came here in 1898. I grew up in Skokie, which at the time I grew up in was predominantly Jewish. I went to a high school that was 3,200. The only people of color were 10 Asians, and I was related to 5 of them. So I grew up almost like a white Jewish suburban kid. And my parents, reacting to the internment camps, sort of taught me and raised me to assimilate into a white middle-class identity. And so when I was in high school and a white friend would say to me, "I think of you, David, just like a white person," I would go, "Yeah, that's great. That's what I want to be." And I went through 5 years of English graduate school without reading, other than the poems by Amiri Baraka, any writer of color. And it was only when I left graduate school, I flunked out. I had 70 completes. That's a whole other story. I wrecked the stereotype of the Asian American student. And I began to read Black writers. And suddenly I realized, oh shit, I'm not white. But who the hell am I? Right? My parents never talked about the internment camps like a lot of their generation. It was just I had a friend who thought they were summer camps until she got to high school. So I had to start learning about race in America. Now, in the early 90s, my friend, the Black novelist, Alex Payton, and I decided to do a performance piece on the Rodney King decision, right? And what happened to Rodney King. Now, this was one of the first early instances of video proof of police brutality. Now, underneath this is a long history of Black and brown people complaining about the interactions with the police, but they were not believed. Their narratives were deemed untrue. And it was only when you had video proof that people began to say, oh, okay, we have to believe our lying eyes. So my friend and I were making this film based on the show that we did. And we were in New York. And we were on like 56th Street. And if you know New York, you know, the side streets, as opposed to Broadway, there's not much traffic. So there's no cabs coming down. So my friend Alex and I, who has black guy with dreadlocks, I said, let's go down to Broadway and get a cab. And Alex says, okay, maybe because I'm with you, I can get a cab. But I'm a Black man with dreads. I stand here in front of the hotel because then the cab driver will think I stayed at the hotel overnight so he can pick me up. But otherwise, because I'm a Black man with dreads, no cab driver will stop for me. That's why I stand here. That was a lesson for me. And I immediately flashed back to a conversation that happened a few weeks before, where Alex and I were meeting with 5 Black artists: the theater director, a Black television script writer, a Black actor, and a Black visual artist. And at a certain point, they began all to talk, these 5 Black men, 6 Black men, talk about being arrested driving while Black. Now, I don't think they would have had the same conversation, or even that conversation, if a white person had been at the table. They knew I was friends with Alex. They knew something about my work. So I think they felt comfortable enough to talk about it. And I was struck with how all of them regarded it as inevitable. It was just something that they all experienced and that they all had to go through. The second thing I was struck with was that they told it as stories. And the stories were laced with humor, and the humor was making fun of their own reactions, their sense of fear, their sense of like, some of them like, you know, this shouldn't happen to me because I'm middle class. I've made it, right? And they're making fun of their own reactions. And I think had there been a white person at the table, again, I don't think there would have been the humor. It would have been the same thing as when Dave Chappelle thought, are white people laughing at my jokes differently than Black people? Do they get it? But what struck me is ostensibly I was like them. We were all artists. We were all sort of making it. But I didn't have to worry about being arrested driving while Black. I didn't have to think about where I was going to get a cab in New York City. And it was my privilege as a middle-class Asian American not to have to think about this. And that was why I had to learn about these things. I could not live just inside the bubble of my own concerns or my own community. I had to begin learning about other communities, the experiences and narratives of other communities. I had to learn what I had not experienced as an Asian American and African Americans and other people of color had experienced. Contrary to the ways I've been educated in the ideology of whiteness, I had to investigate and learn about race in America in a deeper and more thoughtful way. And the more I learned, frankly, the angrier I got. Now, you can say, okay, that was in the early 90s, right? I live in Minneapolis. I live not more than 3 miles from where Philando Castile was killed by a police officer. Not more than 3 miles from where George Floyd was murdered. 2 of my kids live about a half mile from there. My wife works at a hospital about a mile from there. They went to high school maybe about a mile away from there. So this was all very close. And when Philando Castile was killed in 2017, the circumstances were this. Officer Geronimo Yanez had reports that 2 Black men with dreads had robbed a convenience store. So he saw Philando Castile was a Black man with dreads and said, okay, and there were 2 occupants seemed to be in the car. So he thought, okay, I'm going to follow these, and he stopped them. He stopped the car for broken taillights. Of course, there were no broken taillights. And at this encounter, Castile informed him, like, I have a gun permit, I have a gun. And he's reaching for his license, and Geronimo Yanez kills him, right? Now, what you notice in the response of the conservative press was there were headlines like this: confirmed Philando Castile was an armed robbery suspect. False media narrative now driving cop killings. A conservative commentator says, because of this, because he was a criminal suspect, anything else was a moot point. And so the assumption is that he was guilty from the start. It wasn't, when they talked to people at the J.J. Hill School where he worked as a cafeteria worker, he was beloved. Everybody talked about how he knew all the kids' names. He knew what kids had allergies. He knew the foods that they liked. And one kid said, can't you tell the police they got the wrong guy? He's our Philando. I had a student who knew him, and she called him Mr. Rogers with dreadlocks. But he was guilty. Now the question is, does this have anything to do with American history? Well, as I began to look into American history, one of the things you notice in the 19th century is that there are studies which purport to show Blacks are naturally criminals. Now they do this by every crime by a Black person was indicative of Black criminality. And they explain white criminality there was no white criminality. Each white person that committed a crime was seen as an individual. Plus, they would talk about socioeconomic things like poverty. That is not what they did with Black suspects. Okay. Now, the other thing that happened was, I grew up thinking like, okay, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the slaves were free. What I never thought about is like, well, did all the slave owners in the South go, okay, Black people are free, they're fellow citizens, I have to change my complete mentality about how I think about them? That didn't happen. Instead, what happened was a racial regression. And every movement forward in American history and racial progress has been met by an equally forceful racial regression. The only difference is that that regression cannot use the terms of the previous racial regime. So the whites in the South couldn't say, we're going to reinstitute slavery. But they produced laws. They produced a culture. They produced history, which then reduplicated slavery. They produced things like the Black codes, or Black vagrancy laws, where if you were Black and you were not literally working for a white person, you could be arrested for vagrancy. And not only that, ordinary white citizens could arrest Black people. Now, I would argue that there's some connection between these laws, these social studies, and the notion of Black criminality or brown criminality that is prevalent in our culture and still continues to this day. But there's another aspect, I mean, because the idea is there cannot be systemic racism, right? That's one of the rules of whiteness. You cannot have systemic, you can't even mention it, right? Now, my friend Carolyn Montgomery and I, Holbrook and I, edited an anthology of Minnesota BIPOC writers. And in it, this is what my friend Doug Carney, the poet, wrote about having to tell his children about the killing of Philando Castile and George Floyd. As my wife and I explained to our 10-year-olds, who learned explicitly about a then contemporaneous application of Wisconsin historic killing when St. Anthony police officer Geronimo Yanez murdered Philando Castile, it isn't that law enforcement is simply disinterested in protecting Black people, but that US culture law dictate that our very presence is the thing they are meant to protect against. That white supremacy put me in a position to make this a reasonable conversation to have with my then 6-year-olds is a violence I will never forgive. I will go to work carrying it. I will share social space carrying it. I will form friendships carrying it, yet I will not forgive it. And the fact that every single Black parent in this country must have this conversation with their kids means that racism is systemic. Now, after the killing of George Floyd, a teacher on the mainly Black north side of, or predominantly Black north side of Minneapolis, gave this assignment to her class. She said, "What does America mean to you?" Here's what she wrote. Nearly 100% of my class wrote about their fear of police and police brutality. In 7th grade words, they expressed unjust behaviors by authorities towards them. They are 12, 13 years old. They do not need this weight on their shoulders right now. Their goal should be learning and being a kid. I sat down at my desk and sobbed, thinking of what my students go through on a daily basis when they're walking, playing, and talking, blah, blah. Now, the myth in America is somehow like DEI, critical race study, is infecting the minds of people of color. Well, these are 12-year-olds. They're not studying DEI. They're not studying critical race theory. They're saying America is a racist state simply because that's their experience growing up and living on the streets. But their witness counts for nothing. Their stories count for nothing. So let me go back to the beginning of our country. Let's say I tell you about this man who's a brilliant writer and thinker, an inventor, a scientist, an architect, a creator and purveyor of the principles of equality, freedom, and democracy, a man who helped build a democratic nation. He wrote the key document that started a revolution and birthed our country. You would say, this is a great man, a man to admire. Now, what if I told you, though, that this man enslaved over 600 human beings? What if I told you this man was his era's leading ideologist in support of chattel slavery, that he argued vehemently for the supremacy of the white race and the inferiority of the Black race? What if I told you he took 14-year-old Sally Hemings to Paris, and when she returned at 16, she was pregnant? What if I told you that Sally Hemings was 1/4 Black and his children 1/8 Black, so that his children by her looked white and people remarked on the resemblance to their father? They sure look like you, Tom. What if I told you this man kept these children as slaves before he freed them and never freed the mother of these children even after he died? Now, I'm speaking, of course, of Thomas Jefferson. Now, you would have a totally different opinion based on the second story, right? You would think him evil, psychologically depraved, morally bankrupt, a sexual groomer, a statutory rapist. The least you would say about that man is he's a racist. You would think of him the way you think of, on that Dateline show, To Catch a Predator, right? And then when I'm speaking of Jefferson, do you think of the viewpoint of the 15 or 16-year-old selling Hemmings when her white master comes into the room? What can she do if he makes sexual advances towards her? She's a slave. She doesn't have a choice. Do you think of his children who know their own father keeps them in bondage? Now, white America is very fine with the telling of Jefferson as a democratic idealist, as one of the founding fathers. But for many white Americans, they're not fine with Jefferson the slave owner, the ideologist for slavery, or the story of selling Hemmings and their children. Their story can't be part of the American story. Now, some of you might say, I suppose most people in the room won't say this because you chose to be here, but other people will say, well, David, it was so long ago. Well, first of all, if it was so long ago, why does it bother you that I'm talking about it? Right? If you don't have any connection with Thomas Jefferson, the slave owner, why would it bother you that I'm talking about it? Right? If you don't identify with that part of him, you shouldn't be bothered of it. And it was so long ago. But of course, it's not so long ago. And I'll give you one example. I mean, we all know these statistics about differences in economics, in the justice system in terms of race. Say that blacks are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than whites, even though blacks and whites smoke marijuana at exactly the same rate, right? Well, black patients are half as likely to receive pain medication as white patients for the same condition. Half as likely to receive pain medication for the same condition. And when they receive pain medication, they receive less pain medication. Now, in her book on the race and American health system under the skin, Linda Villarosa cites a 2016 study of 222 white medical students. And half, and this is in 2016, not 1700, not 1800, half of those students believe that black people feel less physical pain than white people. Often because they had this idea somehow black people have thicker skin. Right? Now, Thomas Jefferson, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, he was the leading ideologist and proponent of slavery. And he wrote all sorts of tracts saying about how white people were superior to black people. But he said, because black people feel less physical pain than white people, they were more suited to be slaves. That idea in 2016 is in half of those white medical students. So how far past is our past? I'll give you another example. Moms for Liberty. They want to ban the story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old black girl who in 1960 desegregated the New Orleans school. And she had to walk past a crowd of jeering adults shouting racial epithets. Right? And Moms for Liberty says, we got to ban this book because it harms white kids. It'll make them ashamed of being white. Now, I don't believe that, actually. I mean, first of all, we read that story to my kids and they're half white and they didn't suddenly go, oh, geez, I'm ashamed of you, Mom, and I'm ashamed of being white. They didn't. No, what Moms for Liberty is afraid of is that their white kids will identify with Ruby Bridges. Their white kids will identify with the struggle for racial equality, and they will not identify with the white racists. And that's what they're afraid of. Now, Governor DeSantis in Florida banned the AP history course, which was created by African-American scholars and African-American writers. Now, DeSantis doesn't have a PhD in history, much less African-American history. I'm sure he's never written a poem or a story about African-Americans. And yet he feels perfectly fine with judging this course as having no educational content. He feels perfectly fine with that his judgment is superior to all these African-American writers and scholars. Now, what we don't realize is he's actually acting in the tradition of a white slave owner. Because when the Africans came from Africa to America, white slave owners forbid them from teaching their language, from teaching their culture, from teaching their history. What is DeSantis doing? He's saying to African-American scholars and writers, we will not teach your history according to the way you see it. So how do we reconcile this? From the very beginning of America, America had two goals. One goal was freedom, equality, and democracy. But the other goal was to maintain white supremacy. The ability of white people to have political, economic, cultural, and in the case of slavery, absolute power over people of color. Now, Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton has described slavery as a necessary evil. Necessary, right? First of all, the scholars have pointed out that it would have been cheaper to enslave poor whites and criminals from Europe than create the slave trade. But why didn't they do that? It would break up the power of whiteness, right? To organize and make white people see themselves as a separate group. Now, Cotton was reacting to the 1619 Project, a new origin story in the New York Times, one of whose thesis was that the bringing of slaves to America was a key moment in American history, and it, in fact, actually helped create a large portion of our history. And you cannot tell our history without looking at this fundamental fact. But in an example of systemic racism, Cotton introduces a bill which forbids any federal funds from being used to support the teaching of the 1619 Project. Now, we all contribute to the federal government, right? And I'm sure most of the people in the room would say, you should be able to teach that. But it's systemic. You can't teach that with federal funds now. Now, in arguing this, Cotton illustrates a common racist trope. Whiteness makes itself the victim of its own crimes and then tells that tale to itself. Cotton transforms any statement of the fact that white people have been abusing Black people since 1619 into a threat to white people, not Black people. After all, it's not Black people who think the 1619 Project is a threat to the Union. Frankly, as my verb suggests, this is an abuser's psychology on a group level. The problem is that what white people have done to Black people throughout our history, but that Black people keep remembering that history, keep remembering what white people have done to them. And somehow, that harms white people and victimizes them. It's an abuser psychology, right? It's like, the problem is you keep remembering that I abused you. Not that I abused you. Now, when I say whiteness, let me be clear. I'm not talking specifically about any white person. I'm talking about a set of ideas, rules, beliefs, and practices which promote white supremacy and allow it to be maintained in America. And any white person can abandon whiteness, can go like, I don't believe these rules. I don't accept these beliefs. I protest that this is the way that things are run, right? But one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is look at the very bottom of all of this. And one of the rules has to do with epistemology, with the evaluation of knowledge. And one of the rules of whiteness is that white knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. White knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official, while Black knowledge is always subjective, false or suspicious, invalid, unofficial, unless white people say it is. Well, you can come out of that premise and look at everything in our society. Encounters with the police, who is to be believed, right? A Black patient in the emergency room saying to the doctor, I have pain. And the doctor going, no, no, you don't really, right? I'm not going to believe your narrative. And my narrative, my assessment of your pain is superior to your own tale of your own pain. It's the same mechanism. So there are rules to whiteness, which we don't always quite perceive, right? One is whiteness is like Fight Club, right? That movie, remember? Don't talk about whiteness. You cannot talk about whiteness. Another rule is you ignore our racial history and assume there's no connection between our past and present. You assume racism is always less extensive than people of color say it is. You assume that people of color are not credible witnesses to their own existence and lives. You assume that only the white perspective in epistemology matters. Only whiteness gets to determine what is objective and what is the nature of reality, what is official. And this includes the definition of racism. The vast majority of white Americans would argue that racism is not systemic. They would argue for the definition of racism, in which it doesn't really exist. Because in order for racism to exist, according to the definition, you have to not only conscious believe that white people are superior, you have to act and say you're acting with that belief. So you've defined racism in a way where there is no racism, because nobody gets up, well, maybe Trump, but other than that, nobody gets up and actually says that, right? Now, what this definition also does is it talks only about conscious belief. Studies have shown that you can profess to believe in racial equality, but still act in a racially biased manner. And even people of color can do this, right? They've done studies where Black teachers and white teachers will chastigate Black students for behaviors that they will ignore in white students, right? So this primacy of a white view of reality over the reality of people of color is what unites the racism of the past and the racism of the present. Now, the other problem with this is we as people of color, this ideology infects us. It infects us with self-doubt. It infects us with feelings of inferiority. It affects us with alienation from our body. I'm writing on a book on Asian Americans to be my next book, and I'm using a book called Racial Disassociation, Racial Melancholy. And the melancholy, the authors believe, it's Asian American literary academic and a therapist, is that the way they put it is oftentimes people of color, they can't stop mourning. And what they're mourning for is whiteness. That sense of belonging that whiteness gives white people, the sense that you are right, that your narratives are believed. And so one of the things I constantly tell younger people of color is don't give whiteness any room in your head. The thing that you can't change the world outside, but you can make whiteness, the voice of whiteness, smaller and smaller inside your head. And the other thing about the body is You know, if you're a person of color, how are you labeled a person of color? It's your body. And, you know, if you're somebody, you know, like I am Asian American, I didn't grow up looking at Asian American heroes. I didn't grow up looking at characters who were the lover and Asian. And so through a lot of my life, I would look at my own face in the mirror and go, there's something I didn't identify with, which is bodily dissociation. And one of the things that helped me was doing theater. Because in theater, you have to be present in your body. In one of the roles, I played the king in The King and I. And so I had to imagine growing up where Asians were not marginalized, where I was actually the king of the country, where whiteness was not a voice in my head, and where my body was part of the norm. And that's one of the reasons why I often watch Asian films, because suddenly I'm in this universe where I'm no longer marginal, right? I mean, you know, there are Asian villains in movies, but they're Asian heroes, right? And I really had to consciously work to accept my own body and consciously work to make whiteness smaller in my head. I'll end with a couple points. One is, at the end of my book, I likened what many of us need to go through, especially white people, around race in this country. Now, remember when Baldwin said, to confront one's identity, a crisis in one's identity is scary as confronting death. Well, in Helen Kubler-Ross's book, Death and Dying, she outlines the process through which we come to accept our death, which is a similar process to accepting the end of a certain type of identity and the chance to embrace the new identity. So there's 5 stages of grief that she says, which I believe white America needs to undergo, is denial, anger, bargaining, grief, and acceptance. So stage 1 is denial. There is no racism in America, or so little as to be absolutely minimal. Certainly there's no such thing as systemic racism. That's identity, that's denial. Then there's anger. As your denial is challenged, you feel angry, you will attack the messengers in order to discredit the message. Well, you have to make everything about race. You're the one making trouble. Things were fine here in this school, in this business, in this institution, until you started complaining. Why is everything blamed on white people? White people are discriminated against too. Or even it's whites who are now more discriminated against than people of color. Stage 3, bargaining. After and if your anger subsides, you will bargain. It can't be all that bad. I mean, but not all white people. It's just a few rotten apples. Chris Rock has said, would you want to fly on an airline that had a few rotten apples as pilots? Would you want to go to a surgery department that had a few rotten apples? Of course not. Anyway, yes, racism exists, but how can you say it's systemic? Stage 4, grief. I didn't realize it was this bad. How do you stand it? I feel so sad. Is this really what America is? I'm so ashamed. I feel so guilty. I feel so bad for you. And after grief, there's acceptance. And at that point, the world will look different, right? And then if you accept the end of whiteness, right, you start living your life like it. And what you'll find if you're a white person is the more you abandon the rules of whiteness, the more other white people will get angry. You will become somebody that they disapprove. So the other thing is you will be in a very different psychological space. Very different. And what you will notice is that whatever guilt and shame you feel about being a white person will begin to leave. Now, one final thing. Racism is not only morally wrong, it's stupid. And it's absolutely uncreative. right? I teach creative writing. If you just read one type of writer, you limit your creativity. If you just read white writers, like I was taught in college, in my grad school, you're not receiving all sorts of other ways of looking at the world, all sorts of other sources of inspiration. And if you're running a company, do you want, say, 50 managers exactly like me? Or 50 managers exactly like you? No, you want men and women, LGBTQ folks. You want people of different races, different ethnicities, different ages, different regions of the country, different religions. Because that room will be more creative. That room will have a broader base of knowledge. That room will have more languages in order and cultural understanding in order to deal with the global economy. So why would you want sameness? It's stupid. It's uncreative. Finally, one last point. I said that white knowledge is always valid, true, and official, right? But at every point in American history, African Americans have been right about racial issues, and the majority of white people have been wrong. About slavery, about Jim Crow, about civil rights. And yet white America has never turned to Black America and said, we got it wrong every single time in our history and you got it right. Maybe we should start listening to you. Maybe we should start following your lead. That's the America I want to live in.